everyone. Thank you all for joining us today and welcome to the Monarch Butterfly Conservation webinar series. Today's webinar is Monarch Conservation, Past, Present, and Future. My name is Jenna Tots, Education Coordinator for the Monarch Joint Venture. We are so excited to continue hosting this webinar with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. Before we get started, here are a few webinar community guidelines for the webinar. During the webinar, please put your questions in the chat box. We'll collect those for the Q&A at the end. And just a reminder to please keep the chat professional and friendly. Thank you in advance. If you do pause or click away from the webinar, you're going to need to click on the play button again. It will start where you left off. And if you want to catch back up, you'll need to slide the bar at the bottom of the video window. This webinar will be recorded and posted on both the NCTC and Monarch Joint Venture websites in 2 to 3 weeks. The entire Monarch Conservation Webinar archive is free and available to watch and contains about 8 years worth of Monarch Conservation webinars on both of our websites. If you are joining us today but did not get a chance to pre-register for the webinar, we would like to count you for attendance and be able to send you follow-up resources. So please email me at learn@monarchjointventure.org with your name and email address. Thank you so much. And finally, all of our webinar speakers represent their own viewpoints, which are not necessarily those of NCDC, but in this case, today will probably be the case of MJV's viewpoints. I would like to introduce our speaker now. We are delighted to have Wendy Caldwell, MJV's Executive Director, presenting today. From helping draft the North American Monarch Conservation Plan to coordinating community science, teaching teachers, and supporting monarch research, Wendy has built an extensive background in monarch conservation over the last nearly 15 years. In growing the partnership to nearly 130 organizations today, Wendy has led the MJV through many transitions as the partnership diversified, staff grew, and the organization transitioned from a university program to become a standalone nonprofit. Through 2018, the university fostered the MJV's growth and development, enabling it to embark on a new path to where it is today as a thriving nonprofit entity. Growing up on a farm in West Central Minnesota, Wendy understands the value of hard work and perseverance. While pursuing degrees in environmental science and entomology at the University of Minnesota, she worked as a program coordinator for several initiatives at the university's Monarch Lab. While she has worked directly on monarch conservation in some capacity since 2007, Wendy also has broader conservation and research experience through positions held with the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, and the Illinois Natural History Survey. She enjoys spending time outdoors with her family, doing just about anything: sports, hiking, kayaking, gardening, invasive species removal, bird watching, and we cannot forget milkweed seed collection and more. So welcome, Wendy. I will toss it over to you.
Thanks, Jenna. Yeah, I'll have to update my bio with the milkweed seed collection. Forgot the step of sharing my screen. Here we go. Well, thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to wrap up the 2023 webinar series. It's been a journey for me to prepare this history lesson in monarch conservation through time. And so I'm going to share a lot of information today, a glimpse into a lot of different aspects of monarch conservation, and many of which was before my time with monarchs and monarch conservation. Undoubtedly, I will miss things. I hope that I don't misrepresent anything in the timeline of monarch conservation, but there's just so much happening in this incredible species conservation movement that undoubtedly I will miss things, and I will apologize in advance for that. So starting with the basics, I wanted to just, set some groundwork for monarch conservation. In its simplest form is they need the basics of there's monarch breeding, monarch migration, and monarch overwintering. To accommodate those aspects of their annual life cycle, monarchs need milkweeds, they need nectar resources, they need roosting sites and shelters, and they need overwintering habitats with the right climatic conditions to survive the winter. So these are basic needs that monarch conservation has. Seems relatively straightforward. But as we start to unfold this monarch story, the incredible migration, all of the different facets of monarchs, we learn that the story is actually pretty complicated. So there's a complicating dynamic of the North American migrations, this tendency of monarchs to, or not tendency, the behavior of monarchs to migrate, a fall migration and a two-step northward migration as well, adds complexity to this system and this story, because monarchs have different needs at different times, and the timing and availability of those resources is extremely important in the overall success of this population. So every factor of time and space influences what happens next in the overarching monarch dynamic picture. Beyond that monarch migration and the wide geographic range, we look at how do we approach a topic like monarch conservation that spans North America. A couple of different complicating dynamics, as I've named it here. We look at things like ecoregions. How do we devise a conservation strategy that focuses on what's appropriate, what's the appropriate plants and habitat types for different ecoregions of the United States and, well, across North America, as you can see on the map on the right. We also think about the map on the left with different monarch needs at different times and in different places, and we call these monarch conservation units. So how do you break apart these strategies or fit together these strategies for monarch conservation, depending on where the conservation opportunity is, and what the monarchs need most in that time and space. So we think about it in ecoregions, we think about it in monarch conservation units. Not to mention that even though the North American monarch population represents the vast majority of monarchs, there are monarchs in other places globally. So we think about those dynamics as well, of how does this North American population. So yeah, as I was saying, monarchs have global populations, and so we need to think about those dynamics as well as we devise a species conservation approach. Threats are an obvious complicating dynamic to species conservation. So we're looking at, investigating, and continuing to try to address some of these conservation threats to monarchs, like natural enemies, predators, parasites, parasitoids, the effects of changing climate, severe weather events, and drought conditions, and all the things that might affect monarch habitat or monarchs using those habitats, such as the overwintering storms in Mexico. We look at land use change and how we maximize the economics of the landscape, and that often results in wall-to-wall agriculture or urban developments, and there's not a lot of room left for conservation. We think about what we're putting onto the landscape, pesticides in our agricultural fields, in our backyards, and the plants that we're buying from the greenhouse. All of these threats that interact and ultimately affect monarch population success. The list I have here around knowledge gaps doesn't mean that we don't know anything about these topics. We know a lot about monarch conservation. We know a lot about habitat and their habitat needs. But oftentimes we find that there are these sometimes small but really important nuances about that we need to continue to investigate and better understand the geographic variability of the timing of. So all of these things have little nuances that we need to continuously better understand to modify our conservation approaches, like habitat, how is it distributed? How is it connected? What's the quality of that habitat? How are we managing it? Are we gaining or losing habitat? How are invasive species, plants and animals, impacting monarch habitat and the monarchs using those habitats? What are the impacts of pesticides in different landscapes? How are monarchs surviving and reproducing? What are the predator and parasitoid dynamics? How and to what extent are climate and weather? We know these are really important factors in monarch conservation, but we have to start to understand all of these nuances so that we can figure out how to more effectively conserve monarchs moving forward. And I think, understanding any one of these things in and of itself is important, but we also then add this level of complexity, and we have to understand how those threats or research questions, how do those things all interact together? But, I think in today's conversation, and always, there's reason to protect monarchs. We know we've all seen these charts before, looking at monarch population decline, how the population has declined since these early times of measuring monarch populations. But this also adds complication. This chart is both rich with incredible and scientifically robust information, but there's also different ways to look at it in terms of, if you look at overall over the past few decades, you can see a clear downward trend in the eastern monarch population. However, if you look at simply the last 10 years of data that we have for the overwintering population, as is the criteria for the IUCN, we'll talk a little bit more about that process later, but with this downlisting of migratory monarchs from endangered to vulnerable, that criteria looked particularly at the last 10 years. And that last 10 years of data tells a slightly different story than the overall monarch population change through time since it was monitored starting in 1993. Similarly, in the West, we see this decline overall in the monarch population to the point where the population reached just a few thousand butterflies, which then the following year added another complication, a welcomed complication, that this population that was so severely diminished, all of a sudden had a pretty dramatic rebound that couldn't quite be explained. And so it adds to the mystery and the awe of how do we conserve this species that we're continuing every year, every decade to learn more about. As I get into the history of monarch conservation, this next section, buckle up for a history lesson in the past of monarch conservation. I thought it would be fun to kick off with this side-by-side of the monarch initial debut of the August 1976 edition of National Geographic, presenting to the world the discovery of the overwintering sites in Mexico, side by side with the issue just released this week for January 2024 National Geographic, talking about monarch conservation efforts today. So digging into really early monarch history, there's a lot of information here, and so I just wanted to share a little bit about how there are a lot of incredible milestones through monarch conservation history, but I'm going to hit some of the major milestones in this movement, stemming back to and a lot of this information, if you don't have access to or don't have an opportunity, the North American Monarch Conservation Plan does a really incredible job of documenting some of this history, and so a lot of the information I'm pulling comes directly from that North American Monarch Conservation Plan. stepping back to 1857, where we saw the first official report of dark clouds of monarchs in the Mississippi Valley. In the 1930s, we started to hear from the Urquharts, from the Canadian researcher Fred Urquhart, who began the tagging program in the 1930s. But then it wasn't until 1953 that Fred and Nora enlisted 12 volunteers to help with their tagging program initially. By 1971, they had over 600 volunteers, which is incredible for that time and space. A couple of years later, in 1973, Ken Brugger and his wife Catalina offered to support this search for where monarchs were going in Mexico, their search for their overwintering sites. They had put out an advertisement, and Ken and Catalina responded to that and offered their help in leading this search. It was in 1975, January of 1975, that they reported back to the Urquharts, reporting their discovery of overwintering monarchs in Mexico. The next year, Fred and Nora visited and had the incredible fortune to recover one of the tags that their volunteers had put on. A teacher, a volunteer out of Chaska, Minnesota, named Jim Gilbert. In the, kind of stepping forward into the 1980s, so there's a series of federal decrees in Mexico that worked to protect overwintering areas. The first federal decree came in 1980, where there was some loose definition around protecting monarchs in Mexico, those overwintering areas, without necessarily specifying the locations, but also restricting logging activities primarily during the overwintering season from November to March. In 1983, we heard from the IUCN. So winter roosts in both Mexico and California were designated as a threatened phenomenon and by IUCN. And so this is the first designation of a biological phenomenon versus species in the history of international conservation. That second decree in Mexico came in 1986. It provided more protection, more definition around the area, 5 discrete areas along in the state of Mexico and state of Michoacan in Mexico to protect that area further. In 1987, California legislature passed an assembly bill recognizing monarch migration and wintering aggregation as a natural resource, and really encouraged the protection of those overwintering habitats in California. In 1995, Canada and Mexico signed a declaration really working to create an international network of monarch butterfly reserves. In 1997, Ontario passed the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act, which is when they started requiring permits for monarch handling activities. And then kind of spread throughout the 1990s, we saw many of the instrumental foundational monarch community science programs established: the Monarch Watch Tagging Program, Journey North, and the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, to name a few. That third and final decree from Mexico was put into place in 2000, and this established the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, increasing that both kind of named the reserve, but also increased the area of that core habitat, along with a buffer habitat to really protect the overwintering colonies in Mexico. In 2003, Species at Risk Act in Canada listed monarchs as a species of special concern. 2006, the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve was inscribed in UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. In 2007, we saw CONAMP in Mexico develop a national strategy for sustainable tourism in these protected areas, and listed monarchs under special protection in the species at risk standard by the Mexican government. 2012, I named this meeting. It's one of a few that have happened in the history of monarch conservation. There's been a precedent for international monarch conservation meetings, often inviting stakeholders from all over and inviting a lot of research discussion, resulting in publications. And so the most recent meeting that many are familiar with was in 2012 at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. So this is a meeting that ends up kind of instilled in the memories of monarch conservation, even though there were a few more before that. I also lumped a series of meetings over the course of a little more than a decade, where there were national and international meetings of federal agencies, researchers, and other stakeholders surrounding monarch conservation, actively involved in monarch research, monarch conservation, had a suite of meetings and different interactions around monarchs that ultimately led up to the development of the North American Monarch Conservation Plan that was published in 2008. Shortly after this, as this plan was published, the Monarch joint venture was formed to really help uphold and coordinate and organize a network around conservation actions across the U.S. So 2008 was that fundamental time period where the North American Plan was established and Monarch joint venture was formed. Looking at a little bit more recent history, from 2014, we saw that initial petition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to consider listing monarchs under the Endangered Species Act. We also saw a presidential memorandum that included provisions for monarch butterfly conservation. In 2015, the government again published a federal strategy promoting the health of honeybees and other pollinators. We saw some momentum in 2016 where there were different Endangered Species Act tools, like a conference report with the Natural Resource Conservation Service to help engage in Farm Bill conservation programs for monarchs. In 2017, we saw a flurry of monarch conservation research that came out that really helped. It was critical in helping to inform conservation strategies and targets. In 2018, 2019, we saw some momentum from state wildlife agencies and the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies regional approaches, putting forward a Mid-America Monarch Conservation Strategy, a Western Monarch Butterfly Conservation Plan. We also saw a monumental movement for the energy and transportation sector for a candidate conservation agreement with assurances, a nationwide CCAA for monarch butterflies on energy and transportation lands. Leading up to 2020, which we're all familiar with, when monarchs were considered warranted but precluded for listing under the Endangered Species Act. That CCAA was finalized, and then kind of bringing us to the last few years, I wanted to draw attention for the sake of planning. MJV has maintained a monarch conservation implementation plan as well, kind of focused on US-based actions. Our most recent plan from 2021. And then we saw this sequence of the IUCN listing migratory monarchs as endangered and then downlisting them to vulnerable. Honing in specifically on the U.S. Endangered Species Act, that petition, as I mentioned, happened in 2014. From 2015 to 2018, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was gathering all of the research and information available for monarchs, conducting this global species status assessment. They were also gathering information through what's called the Monarch Conservation Database. They were gathering as much information as they could from all of these stakeholders for monarch conservation about what they were actively doing on the ground or planning, so that they could factor that into their assessment and decision. In 2020, that warranted but precluded finding was issued, leading us to the unexpected proposed rule in September of 2024 if the Fish and Wildlife Service determines that listing monarchs is still warranted. I think I didn't put a slide, but I'll talk about it anyways, that IUCN downlisting from migratory monarchs going from endangered to vulnerable primarily has to do with that, what I was talking about in the population chart, really kind of a difference between IUCN criteria really being focused on decline within the last 10 years and versus the overall population. And so it was really the way that the data were looked at that changed that ranking from endangered to vulnerable, primarily around that time frame discrepancy with what their criteria were asking for. It wasn't necessarily any immediate change in the status of the monarch population. So that was rich history, kind of switching over to the people side of conservation and this notion of all hands on deck to conserve monarch butterflies. This brings us to how the network has grown through time. So Monarch Joint Venture started back in 2008 with 10 partners that had been close to monarch conservation for a long time and wanted to help grow this movement around monarch conservation. We had some foundational years in growing the strategy and working to find ways to engage new partners, and saw a lot of momentum leading up to and following that petition for Endangered Species Act listing, and that trajectory kind of continues on today as this partnership network has grown to over 130 organizations. Logos pictured here, this network represents a lot of different scales and approaches to conservation, from federal agencies to businesses to NGOs, state agencies, local volunteer-led groups. We all have a role to play in monarch conservation. This notion of all hands on deck comes from Thogmartin et al. In 2017, one of those foundational research pieces that helped us to establish these targets for sustainable monarch population size. So this research focuses on the eastern population. That goal for sustaining eastern monarchs is an overwintering population size of 6 hectares. So still, at 2 hectares, we're well below that population goal. And so what this research did, to boil it down, what this research did was really look at different land use sectors and different possibilities, different rates of adoption, and how could we, to get to that 6 hectare population size, it was estimated that we needed an additional 1.3 to 1.8 billion milkweed stems on the landscape to accomplish that population growth, to get to 6 hectares, to sustain at 6 hectares, I should say. So how are we going to put those milkweeds on the landscape? This research explored many different scenarios, really ultimately to come to the conclusion that we need each and every one of these sectors, land use sectors, to play a part in monarch conservation if we want to reach that target. Ag lands, rights of way, developed spaces, public lands, conservation lands. Really, we need everyone to play a role in monarch conservation. So this network, this is where we bring in this network. We look at the Monarch Joint Venture as this network model of there are groups working together, both directly and tangentially. They're sharing information, they're pulling in different organizations, different approaches to conservation. And so how can we leverage all of these nodes between partners to help gain momentum in this movement? I want to highlight some of the different networks and networks within the network, so to speak. So there are a lot of different, even though our partnership is 130 organizations, even within that, there are individual, or there are smaller scale, there are different approaches to coordination and gathering partners. One of the primary coordination aspects we've seen in monarch conservation is regionally through the state wildlife agencies in both the Midwest region and the Western region, both that have put together these regional monarch conservation strategies or monarch conservation plans. We see this coordination and collaboration happening also at the state level. We're seeing a lot of different states organize partners around monarch and pollinator conservation. So here's just a few examples of different states that have convened collaboratives around monarch and pollinator conservation. Sectors are convening around different land use types. So we're seeing some momentum around the agricultural space through groups like Farmers for Monarchs or the California Pollinator Coalition. We see different programs that are offering plant materials and support and different technical assistance and approaches to specifically engage farmers and ranchers in monarch and pollinator conservation. And there are also programs to help certify that habitat to make sure that the actions we're taking on these farms are deemed pollinator friendly. In the energy and transportation space, one of the main groups that we work with is the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group. As I've mentioned before, they were responsible for this nationwide candidate conservation agreement on energy and transportation lands, which has done an incredible job of enrolling and enlisting a whole suite of energy and transportation entities in conservation, in monarch conservation. There are an abundance of resources for literature reviews and technical guidelines for roadside habitats for monarchs. We're seeing a lot of energy and engagement in the solar space for how do we create pollinator friendly vegetation establishment in these new existing and new solar installations that are being put into the ground. So working with groups like Solar Synergy or the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund that has the Solar Synergy program. And finally, there are fun initiatives like the Pollinator Power Party, where we can help celebrate and bring awareness to the sector in a more fun and educational way. Federal agencies have been core to collaboration and network building with monarch conservation. We work with a lot of different federal agencies, as you can see listed here, helping to establish the Monarch joint venture in its early days and continuing to be a primary supporter today. Forest Service international programs has been instrumental in helping to connect partners across the U.S. internationally. We also work closely with other agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service, who's recently established their Center for Pollinator Conservation. In the ag world, work groups like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and others as well, U.S. Geological Survey, Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and more recently, the Department of Defense Legacy Program. These agencies all have incredible opportunities to not just influence the lands that they might manage, but also to affect conservation in a much bigger way, which has absolutely been the case in monarch conservation. Within this network, we see a lot of opportunities at the community level to engage, from campaigns like Miles for Monarchs getting active, to the well-known Pollinator Week festivities, where folks are organizing events around National Pollinator Week. We see cities and municipalities taking pledges to either through the Mayor's Monarch Pledge or pledging to become a Bee City USA, for example. communities are nationwide gathering and organizing things like a Monarch Festival. The Minneapolis Monarch Festival has been going on for a long time and is just growing every year in its impact and reach. And there are programs to help spread awareness and take action to put a monarch habitat in the ground, but help establish some interpretive signage and register that habitat, such as through the Monarch Way Station program. So these are just to name a few of the ways that communities are organizing and engaging around monarch conservation. Community science has been a stronghold in monarch conservation. So much of what we know about monarchs comes from many of these foundational community science programs that have existed for a long time and continue to support this movement today. So we see projects ranging from Project Monarch Health, that's sampling for monarch parasites, to opportunistic observations through the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper and Journey North, to more in-depth surveys through the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, looking at milkweed plants for eggs and larvae, or through tagging monarchs. So a lot of different opportunities to build this network, to build the monarch conservation network through community science by engaging people in the science of monarch conservation, but also providing this really foundational data to continuously improve our understanding of monarchs and how to conserve them. Monarch conservation has seen really amazing scientific collaboration. To highlight a few examples of that here, there have been some books published compiling monarch research, Monarchs in a Changing World, or the Monarch Butterfly, Biology and Conservation. So these are books that pull together a lot of different research articles that have spanned the time of monarch conservation. More recently, the Monarch Joint Venture annually puts together a monarch research review. So we're compiling all of the peer-reviewed literature that supports and impacts monarch conservation strategies, and distilling that down and presenting it back out to this network of stakeholders to help inform their conservation efforts moving forward. The Monarch Conservation Science Partnership has been instrumental both nationally across the US and has convened tri-nationally to bring research delegations together to talk about and explore and investigate and pursue different data sets, different research questions that we have, and how we can kind of inform the community about more effective conservation. So this network of researchers has been really instrumental in driving forward our community conservation targets and our pooling together of data sets and resources to better understand monarchs and their conservation. And for example, at times, pursuing the development of new protocols that can help fill those data gaps. So this group also helped to set the stage for and develop the integrated monarch monitoring program, really to try to help fulfill some of the data gaps that we had based on these research conversations. So all this to say, I think it's all hands on deck. Each sector is convening, but there's also importance in cross-sector collaboration. And so at MJV, we really work to bring all of these different voices and perspectives to the table and inspire cross-sector collaboration. How can we build momentum around collaboration, around shared objectives, not just for monarchs, but with this notion of multiple benefits in mind, that the work we're doing for monarchs really lends itself to a much bigger opportunity to touch at water quality and soil health and climate change, mental health and well-being. So there are a lot of different aspects that monarch conservation touches. And so it's really important that we're all working together in this space. Our role at Monarch Joint Venture has been to help convene and connect all of these moving parts, and also distilling the current information, best practices, into a somewhat of an information clearinghouse to make sure that all these players have the information that they need to be successful. Where those tools don't exist, we can help to curate those tools and resources, and finally, kind of providing this network of organizations and partners technical guidance, planning, prioritization. We do this through, we call them 4 pillars. So of great importance to us is science-based conservation, making sure that these recommended practices are founded in science. How do we use education tools to reach broader audiences? And we accomplish this through partnership, through collaboration, and ultimately with this goal of all of these actions leading to more and higher quality habitat on the ground for monarchs and other pollinators. So monarchs are charismatic. We know that they have this charisma, this familiarity that everyone knows and loves monarchs, and there's reason to protect them. They inspire creativity, and there are many more educational resources that I couldn't fit on this screen. So whether it's through artwork or through athleticism or through writing, or through presentation of informational materials or curriculum surrounding schoolyard gardens and monarch conservation, this insect has incredible creativity and educational inspiration and potential. They are a flagship. They, as I've said throughout this presentation, the work we do for monarch butterflies, our goal has always been to leverage the charisma of this insect as a flagship for a much bigger conservation conversation. There's a lot of momentum, as you've seen, and just scratched the surface of some of the moving parts of this movement. I think there's incredible momentum in monarch and pollinator conservation that leads to innovations as new partners become involved. There's innovation in this space, from developing machine learning and artificial intelligence through platforms like Poly, where we're using that artificial intelligence to detect and quantify habitat metrics using images captured by drones. We see programs looking at, nanotechnology and microchips, and how can we use Modus wildlife tracking systems to take a more sophisticated approach to tracking movements. We're using LiDAR to model and try to better quantify monarchs in their overwintering sites. We're using tools like online tools to increase our reach, and how can we tailor opportunities to get involved and to become educated for how to get involved in monarch conservation through things like online learning management systems. There's support and collaboration. I highlight here just a few Monarch Joint Venture resources, but that's not to discount the abundance of partner resources that are available online, on our website, on partners' websites. So just looking at kind of different support mechanisms, this webinar series and 8 years of presenting, drawing from the expertise of this network and sharing that information out via webinars. The richness and incredible expertise of the Monarch Joint Venture team. We have staff coast to coast now that are engaging partners and engaging programs in support of monarch conservation. So shout out to our incredible team. We have resources to no end on 1 or 2 page handouts, sharing information out on social media. We have a milkweed and wildflower vendor map to help source plant materials in different ways. And we're increasing the sophistication of some of the tools that can help connect our partners in our network through an online partner portal. So in closing, I mean, I do feel like there are a lot of moving parts, but there is so much momentum and so much collaboration in this space that I leave us with a message of hope for that we can and will make a difference for monarch butterflies and other pollinators. So with that, I thank you for the time today, and we'll turn it back to Jenna and happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy, for sharing your knowledge with us today. We're going to take the next few minutes for a Q&A. If we don't have time to answer every question, I will send the remaining questions over to Wendy after the webinar, and will include those answers in our follow-up email, which will actually go out tomorrow prior to the holiday. It will go out to everyone that has registered. So again, if you have not registered for the webinar, please email me, learn@monarchjointventure.org, and I will get that email to you. All right, so let's start here. It goes back to the beginning of the presentation, Wendy. Is the monarch indigenous to the non-North American areas they are found?
That's a good question. I think there is theory and speculation that monarchs globally have moved. The North American population have expanded from the North American population.
Awesome. This is going to be my new question for the 2024 series for every speaker. So we'll try it out for you, Wendy. I want to know your favorite milkweed and your favorite nectar plant.
Oh, goodness. You should give us forewarning so we can think about it.
I definitely will. I was like, oh, I'm going to try. We can totally come back too.
No, I've got it. I've got it. My favorite milkweed is world milkweed, because I think it is fascinating that it's this tiny little milkweed, and the number of times I've found big juicy 5th instar caterpillars on it, it just amazes me every time. So for that reason, world milkweed. Maybe not the most practical answer. And my favorite nectar plant is the early season pasque flower.
Excellent. I'm not familiar with that, but I will be looking it up when we are done. We've got a question from a 5th grade class. Eileen is asking, how do monarch butterflies get their colors, but the other butterflies only have one color?
This is a good question. I might have to look up the answer to that question so I don't tell you incorrectly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the mark of a good educator, that when we don't know the answer, we can admit that and say we're going to find it. So to Eileen's 5th grade class, we will include that in the email. So make sure your teacher has signed up for the webinar and that she will receive that email tomorrow. And hopefully you still have school tomorrow and you can get the answer before you head out for the holidays. Okay, this is about the graph of the eastern population and the overwintering sites. Why does the 1995-1996 have such a large jump in numbers? And I don't know if you want to bring that graph back up, if that's helpful.
Bear with me.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at 1995-1996. Yeah, I mean, I think as with many of the ups and downs in population, all of these complicating dynamics of monarchs, it's hard in any of these cases to pinpoint any specific reason for the increase or decrease in the population size. I think there's a lot of hypotheses around the effects of weather and climate. So good weather conditions throughout the season. Monarchs and insects, like most insects, have a really kind of boom and bust reproductive cycle. So they lay a lot of eggs, and with the right conditions can actually produce a lot of individuals. So I think we see that high potential to increase the population if the conditions are good, which revolves a lot around weather and climate. But as the reverse is true, if conditions are poor, then that population isn't going to grow as exponentially. So I would speculate, right, that it had a lot to do with good conditions throughout their breeding range.
Great, thank you. The question about roadside planting. The listener says, I know the roadside planting programs are popular, but aren't they increasing the chances the butterflies are lost to collisions with traffic?
Roadside mortality is something that's been explored a fair amount, and I think in most cases the research shows and suggests that that the benefits outweigh the pros outweigh the cons in terms of roadside habitat for pollinators, with the exception, I think, of a few high monarch traffic areas that, you know, I think there are some areas where monarchs funnel really densely during migration in Texas, and so I think there are some kind of nuances there, but for the most part across the range it's been determined that the benefits do outweigh the cons.
Right. Do you know of anyone working with commercial growers to offer native milkweeds?
Yeah, I didn't touch a lot on I think that in this presentation. Yeah, as we're putting in habitat, there's a great need for increasing the availability and accessibility of native plant materials. So I think there are a lot of different efforts to help encourage and both kind of from the demand side and the supply side. So encouraging consumers to have demand for native, you know, pesticide-free plants. So a lot of that work is happening in the educational and advocacy space. But I think growers are also continuing to, there are programs like the Monarch Watch Milkweed Market and the Milkweed Vendor Map, really, you know, trying to connect consumers with these providers to ramp up their production of those plants. There are federal efforts like the National Seed Strategy and Seeds of Success to try to help protect some of our native species from a seed collection perspective and using that to help start growing out production plots. So there's a lot of things happening there, but I think there always could be more, starting with us in our backyards, and going out and supporting our local native plant producers.
Thank you. New research shows the importance of 3 seasons of bloom with nectar along the entire migration range being important for monarch butterflies and other pollinators. The question here, have the phenology organizations or has other phenology research accumulated enough data to show this graphically? Or do you know of other maybe research happening related to blooming plants and climate change?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think there are certainly efforts tracking phenology through, you know, like the National Phenology Network and various initiatives there to really help document the changes in bloom times and those blooming plant dynamics through time in different geographies. I think the notion of 3 seasons of bloom, really kind of take that with a grain of salt in terms of where you are geographically and what seasons mean to you. Really, the idea is that there's just something available to monarchs, to pollinators throughout as much as humanly possible of the growing season that is your area, or where monarchs are there. But then even when monarchs aren't there, there are likely other pollinators that need blooming resources. So thinking early season all the way to late season and everywhere in between. And we accomplish that by adding diversity to our plantings, to making sure that, because I mean, I think even if there are trends towards a particular plant changing in its phenology and in its bloom times, that's all very nuanced in terms of what are the local climate conditions that year? Is it drought that's going to cause it to bloom early or maybe not bloom at all? And so there are different really localized conditions that the best way to build that resiliency is just to increase the diversity of what we have, because those plants are all going to behave differently in different conditions.
Great. I think we'll do one more question and then we'll do our big announcement. It's another one about roadside habitat. I know it's been something that we have a handout for at MJV and has been brought up a few times internally. Has there been progress in stopping roadside mowing before monarchs are done breeding in that area? You know, that can be pretty site specific.
Yeah, I think it depends on the agency, the roadside authority. I mean, I think there are definitely some opportunities to do more education and engagement around to make sure that those timelines, those mowing timelines are better known for effects on monarchs. I think that we definitely have some resources to help encourage better management timing for monarchs. A lot of, I live in Minnesota, and a lot of our mowing laws, and I anticipate this to be true in other areas as well, but are a little bit more tailored around breeding and migrating birds. And so monarchs and pollinators don't always come to the forefront of mowing timing for a lot of these agencies like the Department of Transportation. And so, I guess also to keep in mind that departments of transportation, whatever the scale, right, are first and foremost have the goal of safety and getting cars from point A to point B. So we just have to kind of balance considerations around how do we engage these sectors, even if their primary goal is not conservation, and find ways to help inform them and work within their strategies to improve conditions for monarchs and roadsides. So the answer is no, we haven't widespread addressed roadside mowing issues. I expect that to always be somewhat of a challenge, but we can continue to distribute information about best practices and timing and making sure that we're advocating for improved practices, whether it's at our state level or county level or township, whatever your jurisdiction is.
Great, thank you. I'll make sure that best practices mowing handout gets put in the email tomorrow. So I just want to say thank you again to Wendy. Thank you to all of you for giving us your questions. Anything that didn't get answered, we'll try to get answered today and send it off. But before we go, we'd like to give you all a sneak peek of our 2024 webinar series. We're going to be offering 12 webinars next year. They will continue to be held on the fourth Tuesday of each month, except in May, November, and December, when they'll be a week earlier. And they will also continue to start at 1 o'clock Central Time. Registration is live. Alyssa is going to post the link in the chat to the webpage that has all the information with all of the webinars listed. And then there's a registration button there that you can click on and sign up right now. You can sign up for just one time, and then you'll get an email each week for each month. And we hope to see you all in the new year, starting in January with our first webinar, Community Engagement and Monarch Conservation Through the Arts, on January 23rd. We'll be joined by staff from El Valor in Chicago and Yesenia Juarez, a fiber artist and founder of Little Village Busy Bees. So we're really excited to get started on our 2024 webinar series. Again, I want to thank Wendy, and I want to thank NCTC for hosting this webinar and for all of you for participating. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.